And particularly, thank you, Carmen, particularly thrilled that our dear friend and an incredible inspiration to me, Kazu Haga, is going to be leading us in a workshop today. But before we move to Kazu, I just want to lift up one of our collaborations with Kazu, which is our Movements of Belonging in-person retreat that we're going to be hosting on Bowen Island, also known as Naklelakwem, here just outside of Vancouver. And it's for Vancouver-based and sort of greater area, surrounding area, activists, frontline organizers, people who are looking for tools and strategies to really create a different paradigm in our movement spaces, in our activist spaces. A paradigm that's about really building belonging, building relationship focused, and attending to some of the not healthy ways that we can be together in those spaces, and learning how to do that in a way that really builds the connection so that almost all of our energy can go to actually achieving the goals that we're looking for, and hopefully even create the world we're longing for within our community that we can then expand out, kind of that idea of fractals and Adrienne Marie's Brown's work. So we invite you all to check out. Carly, do you mind dropping the link in the chat if you haven't already? It's in the agenda, and love to have you check it out and consider whether it's for you and whether you'd like to apply. You're always welcome to reach out to me at info@necessarytotalcollective.org with questions or anything you want to get more information on. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to my dear friend and mentor, Kazu Haga.
Thank you so much. Definitely teaching and mentoring goes both ways. So really honored to be here. My name is Kazu, use he, him pronouns. I am calling from Oakland, California, which is land originally called Huichin by the original shepherds of this land, the Lisjan Ohlone people. And really honored to be here. Crazy time in the world, particularly, I live in the United States, so crazy time today and tomorrow, and we'll see what happens. But I think it's a really important time to be talking about how we want to be with ourselves and with each other when we are in a world of panic. When the world is in panic, it can easily trigger our own panic. And then if we respond to panic from a place of panic, we're only adding more panic to the world. And it's not a dynamic that is conducive to healing, right? One of my favorite quotes that I've been repeating over and over again, ironically, comes from the US Navy SEALs. But they have this beautiful quote that says, slow is smooth and smooth is fast. And I really think it's important because part of why we are in a state of panic collectively is because there's a lot of urgency. Like the issues that we are organizing around climate and in the US elections and rising fascism and all these things, they're incredibly urgent. And we don't have another 50 years to, plan things and prepare ourselves and build movements. We really need to be acting now. And how do we remember that in facing urgency, the more we can actually slow down, the more we can remember to breathe, the smoother we are. And the smoother we are, the faster we can move and the more efficiently we can move, right? So it seems paradoxical to remember to breathe deeply while responding to urgency, but I think that's the kind of challenge of our times, right? So I want to share my screen here and talk about a few things, starting with a brief introduction to myself here. I was born in Tokyo, Japan, and I moved to the United States when I was 7 years old, partly because of a fracture that happened in my own family. And I grew up in a pretty broken home, especially after I moved to the United States. And when I was 17 years old, I heard about this Japanese Buddhist monastics. It's a monastic order called Nipponzan Myohoji. And they're a Buddhist order that's really committed to nonviolence and social change work. And they were organizing a walking pilgrimage. They were going to walk from Massachusetts down the coast, the eastern coast of the United States to New Orleans. and then down the coast of Africa to retrace the slave route, to talk about the legacy that slavery left behind on the United States, and to begin the process of healing from it. And I was a 17-year-old high school dropout, stoner, drunk kid that had nothing going for myself. And I heard about it and I said, I'm bored. I want to get out of town. I'm going to check this thing out for the first week. And I ended up leaving home for a year and a half. I spent 6 months on that walking journey to New Orleans, and then ended up spending a year living in Buddhist monastery across Nepal and India and Sri Lanka, studying with these monastics about Dharma and nonviolence. And when I came back, I was on fire and I got involved in social change work and became a nonviolence trainer. And I've been exploring what it means to be a practitioner of nonviolence ever since. There's obviously a lot more to that story, but I'll just share one more thing, which is that in my journey, one of the most important kind of like stops in my journey towards my own growth and healing has been participating and eventually facilitating these things called jams. Jams have been the most healing space I've ever been to. It has been the space that more than anywhere else very quickly is capable of creating deep, deep spaces of belonging and safety. My partner always says that creating safe space isn't about creating a container where nobody gets hurt. Creating safe space is about creating a container where we feel safe enough to engage with our hurt, right? And to me, that's what jams are. And the movements of belonging that Catherine mentioned is largely modeled after jams. It's like, what if we took jams and moved it into social movement spaces? So I just want to double down on what Catherine was sharing in the invitation to check out movements of belonging. These are some, I want to share some tools that come out of jams, or the places that I learned, tools that I learned from being in jams. One really fundamental tool that many of you may be familiar with already that I found really, really helpful is called the zones of comfort, which is created by an educator named Carl Ronk. And he says that most of the time, for most of us, we live in what we call the comfort zone, which is where we're comfortable, right? Like it's where our breathing is regulated. It's where we're able to take in new information and think about difficult logic and rationale. It's a good place to be, but it's not where growth happens, right? Growth and learning happens in what we call the stretch zone. And the stretch zone, by definition, is uncomfortable because we are being stretched beyond our comfort. Perhaps we're in a low escalation of conflict. Perhaps we're being challenged by a perspective that we either disagree with or is new to us or is just different from us. The stretch zone is where growth happens, right? I always say that if you go to the gym and you're working out and you're not at least a little bit uncomfortable, you're not getting stronger, right? It's also possible to go to the gym and work out too much and you pull a muscle. And that's what we call the panic zone. The panic zone is when your emotions are completely dysregulated, your heartbeat begins to rise, everything becomes binary and black and white in your worldview. You go into this like survival mode where something is either right or wrong, something is either dangerous or you're not. You're not able to take in any new information, right? Like in the stretch zone, you might be uncomfortable, but you're still able to consider other perspectives. In the panic zone, you're right and they're wrong, right? And so we want to explore a little bit about what puts you in the panic zone. And the way we're going to do that is I'm going to offer some scenarios. And what I want you to do is to mark on this screen from on a spectrum from comfort to panic, where these scenarios puts you. And the way we're going to do that is at the top of your screen, you should see this little like dot or the 3 dots. If you click on it, a box will pop up that says annotate. And if you click on annotate, this bar will pop up on the left side of your screen. And if you click on the check mark of that bar, this bar will pop up. And this bar is filled with different shapes that all represent stamps. So if you click on any one of those shapes, the cursor on your mouse turns into a stamp, and you can go anywhere on the screen and click on the screen and you'll be able to put a stamp mark on it. So why don't you all go ahead and try that real quick just to see if that works for you? Yep, I see a couple of people putting stamps up already. And if, oh, I actually, Kristen, I'm not sure how it works on a phone. If you can't figure it out on the phone, you can also put into the chat, or if you have any tech challenges, you can put a 1 to 10 into your chat, with 1 being comfort zone and 10 being panic. Does that make sense? So I want to invite everyone to pause stamping the screen for a second so that I can clear the screen. Oh, what happened here? Okay. So again, I'm going to read some scenarios and just put a check mark or a stamp on the spectrum of where this puts you. When you think about, oh, sorry. When you think about all of the Zoom calls that you have coming up this week, where does that put you? Is that a comfort thing for you? Is it put you in stretch a little bit? Does it put you all the way in panic? I'm seeing most people kind of somewhere in the middle. One person relatively comfortable. There are a couple people like on the right end of stretch, moving into panic. And these are all like spectrums, right? They're not buckets. Okay, so if you could pause and I will clear the screen. So the next prompt is, when you think about engaging, or the possibility of engaging in a direct action with a real risk of arrest, where does that put you? Is that a comfortable thing for you? Is that a little stretchy for you? Or does that put you completely into panic? And I want to invite you to notice, especially for those of you that feel like it puts you into stretch or to panic, to notice like what happens in your body that lets you know that you might be being stretched or that you might be moving towards panic. Like, how do you know? Why did you decide to put your stamp where you did? So take a deep breath as I clear the screen again. The next prompt is, when you think about the reality of the climate crisis, where does that put you? Is that a comfortable thing? Thought about it a ton, you've processed it? Is it stretchy? Does it put you in panic? So yeah, I see most people are certainly on the panic side of stretch. It's really hard to think about the reality of the climate crisis and not at least feel stretched, right? Now, I want to ask folks to perhaps raise their hand and come off of mute and share a little bit of like, what lets you know that something puts you into panic. I'm actually going to stop my screen for a second. What are the things that happens in your body that lets you know that you're either being stretched or that something might put you into panic? What are the warning signs? You can either enter something into the chat or go ahead and raise your hand and come off of mute. How do you know? And this is different for each person. Heat and prickles on the back of my neck. Yeah. What else? How do you know you're in panic? And it might not even be like a body sensation, but you might notice something happening in your mind. Tightness in the chest and stomach. Yeah. Stomach contraction, almost want to throw up. Losing a sense of connection, stomach flip-flopping. Did I hear someone come off of mute?
I did. I didn't go all the way into panic, so I didn't have the physiological things, but when I have like immediate thoughts, like if it's panic, then it could be like racing thoughts or manic thoughts. But when you said about the disruption that's arrestable, I immediately was like, oh, well, I can't because this is it. And I was like, oh, yeah, this is like getting me, this is a sign that it's not exactly stretch, not fully panic mode, but sign.
They're kind of like, oh no, I can't go there. I can't do that. that thought.
Yeah, I like, and the immediacy, like the reactiveness of it.
Mhm.
When I'm having thoughts right away, that's like a sign.
Yeah, definitely that reactivity. It's not like a well thought out response to something, but something just immediately. Awesome. Yeah, really appreciating all the thoughts in the comment as well. I desire to smoke, definitely. I smoked for most of my life, so I can resonate with that. So, let me go. Panic zone isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? Like it's actually an important part of our evolutionary survival mechanisms. It's just that the panic zone serves a very specific purpose that's not always useful, especially when we go into panic based on old traumas or wrong information, right? And so I want to explore a little bit about some of what happens for many of us when we go into panic. I'm going to share my screen again. And this is a tool called the compass of reaction, originally called the compass of shame. And it's essentially like most of us have one of these four ways that we tend to go to when we are in panic. We either withdraw, which is kind of like this response of retreating into yourself and like freezing and isolating yourself. You may be physically present, but emotionally you're completely shut down, right? On the other side of the spectrum of withdrawal is avoidance, where you try to distract yourself with a ton of activities. Like people who are into like a lot of extreme sports and things like that are oftentimes of the avoidance personality. A lot of drinking, smoking, overeating, overworking, addictions. Um, what's different from withdrawal is that like in withdrawal, you're really retreating, you're isolating. In avoidance, you may actually be engaged. You may be in relationship, but you're not actually able to slow down enough to engage with the thing that is putting you into panic, right? You're just like reaching out for anything that helps you avoid. And then on the horizontal axis, you see attack other, which is to blame other people or to blame an entire group of people or to blame a situation and not take responsibility for yourself, to always be pointing fingers. You can get really aggressive, you can get judgmental, you can start making generalizations about people, criticizing people. And then on the opposite side of that spectrum is when you attack yourself. When you go into a shame spiral and to say, oh, I'm never going to be good enough. I always mess up this thing. Self-harm could come into play. There's this concept of over accountability, like taking accountability for everything, including things that actually aren't yours to take on, right? And it's important to know that many of us have like one reaction that we like to go to over and over, but it can also be different depending on the context. Like if I'm in a conflict with my mother, I might go into avoidance. But if I'm in a conflict with my coworker, I might go into attack other, right? Whereas if I'm in a conflict with my intimate relationships, I might go into attack self. But if I'm in a political disagreement with somebody with whom I disagree with politically, I might go back into attack other, right? So it's important to note that none of us are frozen into one type of response, but we all in some ways utilize some level of these four compasses of reaction. And so what I want to invite you to do is to go into small groups. You'll have a good 15 minutes or so, and to talk about these four questions, which I will also put into the chat. What of the four reactions, what are the reactions that you most identify with? Again, withdraw, avoid, attack self, or attack other. What is good about this reaction? Like, why does it work for you? Again, like panic zone responses are not always bad. There's some way in which going to this response is serving you, right? Is protecting something. So what is good about this response? What works about it? Where do you think this reaction comes from? Is it rooted in family dynamics, culture, social identity? And finally, what do you see this how do you see this reaction impacting your life and your work? Where do you see it creep up? The invitation again is to pick one of the reactions that you want to explore a little bit more. Maybe as I was explaining the four types of responses, there was one that you really resonated with. I was like, oh, I go to that one a lot. Or maybe there's one that you don't go to as much that you just want to explore a little bit more. So you have, total freedom. Share with your group which reaction do you most identify with, or which one do you want to explore the most right now? And then what's good about this reaction? Where do you think it comes from? And how do you see it impacting your life and work? Any questions about what we're about to do before we break up into the small groups? Awesome. So yeah, spend 15 minutes or so exploring those concepts, and then we'll come back and do a harvest as a large group.
Gotcha.
Welcome back, everyone. So I just want to slow down and pause a little bit to open it up for any conversations, so stuff that you were talking about in your small groups, questions that came up, any reflections, and then we'll go through a few more pieces. But yeah, what did you all talk about? What's on your mind right now? Yes, Carly.
Okay. Well, in our group, one of the things that came up, and certainly came up for me, was how like family culture, particularly like socialize not to have conflicts out loud, to like go into like use the silent treatment as a method of conflict, using like avoidance in conflict makes some of us like, or makes me anyway, less resilient to dealing with conflict as an adult, and like using avoidance because or self-blame, like self-attack, because we're just not used to having conflicts at all.
Yeah, that resonates for me as a Japanese person for sure, like East Asian culture and conflict. And yeah, any other thoughts? I'd really be curious to hear what anyone talked about that in terms of like, why do these reactions work for you? What about it is protective? What about it is beneficial? But anything else you talked about? Yeah, Janice. Was it Janice? Janice?
Janice.
Janice.
Yeah, I talked about how for me it was pure survival, in the house, in the street. It was just the way to survive was withdrawal avoidance. And
Yeah,
it's served me
totally.
very well. Yeah.
Yeah, it's oftentimes we can kind of get hard on ourselves for having these responses, right? But there is a way in which, especially when we were younger, they really did help us survive. And so it's also important to, it's important to acknowledge like in these ways, these are unskillful responses in my life now. And in these ways, they really help me to survive and to actually appreciate and honor that. Any other thoughts, reflections, questions, comments? Yeah.
I mean, it's not very deep, but for me, sometimes avoidance is just a way of lessening the load. It is a way of checking out to avoid overwhelm. It's probably not always the healthiest, but it is sort of a way of just protecting my low battery or a battery that's being drained rapidly.
Absolutely. And pronounce your name for me?
Deblica.
Deblica. Thank you for that. Yeah, and it's again important to acknowledge like, yeah, sometimes we go into avoidance or withdrawal out of habit. But if we can actually choose, you know what, I'm actually not going to deal with this right now, it gives us a little bit more choice and agency. And that's really important, right? So there are skillful ways that we can utilize some of these strategies. Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah, Cass.
We kind of talked also about like feeling like you've made progress with some of these reactions, but then they still come up, and what that kind of feels which then leads to more reactions in some ways, like negative self-talk or what have you. So yeah, I guess just like trying to remember that if you're some of the practices that we put into our daily lives to prevent these reactions. I don't even know if prevent is the right word, but maybe understand them more. yeah, that those practices are for progress and not for towards perfection, I would say.
That's right. Definitely. And then, like healing and growth is not a linear path, right? Like and even with the panic zone, we oftentimes talk about how like whether you've eaten enough that day or how much you slept the night before can actually impact our ability to go into panic or not. So it's definitely a very dynamic process. And also to give ourselves compassion, for one of my favorite quotes comes from an ancient Greek poet who says, "We don't rise to the level of our expectation, we fall to the level of our training." So it's like we can have these wonderful expectations about how we're going to respond to the next conflict we have in our lives. But then when we get triggered, if we've been trained, if we've been practicing one response to panic our entire lives, it's really hard to break out of that, right? So how do we, like I oftentimes compare nonviolence to a martial art, in that you don't go to a 2-hour karate seminar and then walk away feeling like you understand what karate is and you never need to train again, right? It's a daily, constant practice, as is nonviolence, as is growth, healing, all of these things. Carly says, sometimes I can use avoidance or withdrawal to regulate my body. Yep. And I then deal with something. Yeah, exactly. So like intentional, skillful uses of some things that we sometimes have a tendency to judge, right? I want to share a couple more slides, but I want to see if there's any other burning comments or reflections. And if not, I'll go into slide again. So the panic zone. We can be put into the panic zone by a lot of different things, right? It could be you notice a phone call from a coworker that you don't like, and it could put you in panic. It could be if you were traumatized by like being attacked by a dog when you were young, like a small friendly dog running towards you with its tail wagging might put you into panic. A bad dream might put you into panic. An argument with your partner or like a natural disaster might put you into panic, right? And one of the things that happens when we are in our panic zone is that there's a part of our brain called the prefrontal cortex that literally gets disabled. There's another part of our brain called the amygdala, and some psychologists call it the amygdala hijacking. The amygdala is largely responsible for our emotions, but it's also responsible for like filtering in inputs and deciding whether or not something is a threat. And when the amygdala takes in input and it decides that something is a threat, it physiologically cuts off access to the part of our brain that is responsible for thinking about logic and rationale, that is able to take in new information and different perspectives, that is able to think about nuance, that is able to help you respond as opposed to react to things, that helps you move through life calmly. And all of these things happens on a physiological level because the neocortex is a part of that brain that requires a ton of energy. So when your brain thinks that there is an immediate threat to your survival, it channels all of that energy into the parts of the brain that is responsible for immediate survival, and that is that fight or flight mechanism, right? It puts everything into a binary. It doesn't care about nuance. It doesn't care about logic. There's no logic to a saber-toothed tiger running after you. You just have to react. And so when the brain goes into panic, something happens in the body also, which is this is a lot of you put into the chat earlier, right? Like adrenaline and cortisol is pumped into your entire body. It increases your heart rate, which is what allows oxygen to be pumped throughout your body more. So it helps you to be able to run faster and to fight. Your pupils dilate so that you can see threats better. Your muscles tighten, again, to get ready for that fight or flight. Your digestive systems and immune systems are both compromised because, again, these are all things that require a lot of energy that's not necessary when a saber-toothed tiger is running after you. So it helps with the fight or flight, right? There's a part of your autonomic nervous system called the sympathetic nervous system that kicks in immediately when our brain goes into panic. And that's what like floods our entire bodies with adrenaline and cortisol. So these are things that happens physiologically in our bodies. Essentially, what happens when we go into panic, when we go into our amygdala hijacking, and when the sympathetic nervous system kicks in, is that our ability to practice nonviolence goes out the door. Even if we have values around nonviolence, even if that's our expectation or our desire, when we go into panic, the part of our brain that is able to think about concepts like nonviolence is physiologically not accessible to us. Our ability to think about nuance and empathy and interdependence and compassion, none of those things are available to us when we go into panic. And we live in a world of traumatic triggers right now, right? Like we live in a world of pandemics and genocide and climate catastrophe and electoral, I don't even know what the right word is to describe the US electoral situation right now, right? Like every day when we turn on the news, we're just filled with these things that can put us into panic. But luckily, we have choice and agency over our triggers. When we face an external stimuli, it's not a given that we have to allow that external stimulus to put us into panic. With practice, we can have more and more choice and agency over the things that like puts us into our panic zone, or the things that we can say, you know what, this is really difficult. I'm going to take a deep breath and choose a different response, choose an intentional response. The first thing we have to do with that, of course, is to bring awareness that we are being triggered, to bring awareness that, oh, my heart rate is rising. Oh, my body is heating up. Like oftentimes we notice these things in retrospect, but if we can bring mindfulness to the moment and say, oh, I'm starting to go into panic right now, then we can choose our response to that moment. Long term, a lot of that has to do with our commitment to doing our own trauma healing work and tending to our grief and our rage and to our pain. Because the more trauma we have in our lives, the more likely we are to go into panic. The first time I went to the jam, the gatherings that I was telling you about, it's also the first time I learned about the comfort stretch panic zones. At that point in my life, I would have told you that I was a pretty well-regulated person, that like I didn't go into panic that often, that regularly, that quickly. But at the jam, like people were sharing like really personal, really vulnerable stories from their lives. So I said, you know, all right, I'm going to share something vulnerable. And I shared a story about a childhood, not one incident, but like stories from my childhood where I was experiencing a lot of pain, a lot of harm. And I never talked about it before in my entire life. And the story that I had told myself up to that moment is that, oh, this is something that happened 15, 20 years ago. I'm over it. I've healed, I've moved on. And the moment I started speaking about these traumatic events, I went into complete panic because I had never talked about it. I never processed it. So while my capacity to be in stretch zones in like my day-to-day life was pretty expansive, because I'd never processed that one part of my life, I had very little capacity to be in stretch. Right? Like people who have not had a lot of opportunities to heal and integrate from their traumatic experiences, oftentimes have very little capacity to be in the stretch zone. They go from comfort straight into panic. Right? And that's one of the signs of unresolved trauma, is someone who goes from like having a normal life immediately into panic. I work a lot with incarcerated people, and I remember one person who was telling me that like he was serving a life sentence for a homicide, and he said that, you know, I was having a perfectly normal day. I was having a great day. I just watched a baseball game with some friends. I was sitting in the parking lot of a car, and a complete stranger came up and like bumped up against my car as we walked by. And I ended up getting in a fight and ended up killing this man. And I don't know how I went from a perfectly normal, fun day to taking the life of a complete stranger over nothing. Like, what happened? Right? And it was because there was so much unresolved trauma that this minor incident put him completely into panic. So long term, the work of nonviolence is about what Gandhi called self-purification, like purifying our own heart of the anger and the violence and the resentment and the pain and the hatred that we hold in our hearts. That gives us the spaciousness to continue to breathe in the midst of conflict. One of the things that we can do in the medium term is to be more aware of how we're spending time in our day-to-day. And this is a bit of a tease for the Care and Repair session 2 weeks from now on November 18th, where I'll be facilitating a thing called coping, helping to discern the difference between coping skills versus thriving skills, and making sure that we're utilizing self-care practices that are actually helping us grow. But in the short term, one thing we can do to try to stay regulated, to stay breathing so that when we are in panic, we can get back into our stress zone, is to practice emotional regulation tools. And I'm sharing a link to a handout in the chat here. And we are going to close with a little bit of a practice of one of the emotional regulation tools. But I just want to pause here again and see if there's any questions, reflections, thoughts, answers, comments. But also specifically, I'd love to ask you, when you notice yourself in panic, what are some things that you can do to try to re-regulate, to bring yourself back into stretch? Like, what works for you? Yeah, Catherine.
One of the things that I noticed works for me is to scream swear words really loud. That just like, there's probably something to do with the way you have to breathe in order to be able to scream, but man, that just like really helps.
I love that. There's a part of me that wants to see that in action. What else? Yeah, Andrea.
This is not a response. This is a curiosity.
Oh, anything.
By the time I think we talked in my group, I'm more of an avoidant withdrawal type person. I'm remembering now a time I was in a conflict and I was really angry and blaming another. And yeah, afterwards, I felt like there was like drugs in my system that I just had to metabolize. Like I couldn't, like being high, like where you're like, I'm on a trip now. And I could make space and not say anything worse, but I'm just curious if you relate to or you know about that experience of just feeling like it was just in me, like, and I just had to ride it out, like a bad trip.
Did you feel like that whatever was moving through you was like causing the agitation and heat in your body, that kind of thing? Or what were the sensations that you were feeling?
Yeah. Heat, agitation, and like kind of maybe some mental fixation, like, but I could even feel it going down and I wasn't like wanting to yell anymore, but I just was like, or I wouldn't yell, whatever, engage anymore, but I just felt like, or like dilated kind of.
And anyone kind of resonate with that? Had those similar experiences? Yeah, I see some residents on the screen there, so you're definitely not alone. I imagine that one of the possibilities is that was the adrenaline and cortisol moving through your system. So as I shared, when you go into panic, when your brain feels a threat, within a split second, every cell in your body, it gets pumped with adrenaline and cortisol, and those are the chemicals that makes you your muscles tense and speed up. I should also say there are also chemicals that are pumped into your body when you're watching an exciting sports movie, or when you're making love, when you're giving birth to a child. Like, these aren't all bad things, right? But yeah, it takes some time for your body to really integrate and release all of those chemicals. Some science suggests that it takes a minimum of 6 seconds. But if you're not able to really calm your brain and the rest of your body down, it kind of goes into cycles. So in reality, it takes more than 6 seconds. But if you can take 6 seconds completely breathing calm and remove yourself from the external stimuli, it can integrate faster. So there's an organization that creates all these almost mantras that you can chant that takes 6 seconds that you can try to you know, so it might have been that.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank
Yeah, any other thoughts, reflections, strategies that you use, tools? Yeah, Renee.
I tend to have my worst panics when I have nightmares. They
Mm.
happen maybe once every 3 months. And it's usually about an autocratic government or monarchy or something like that. But I find like it's terror, total freeze. And I usually will just roll over into fetal and I interlace my fingers and I touch my face. And usually that does help me to calm down a bit. I mean, there really isn't, I mean, there's nobody around to talk to. So I guess I kind of go into a self-soothing kind of thing.
Totally. Yeah, that like self-touch is really important and can be really grounding. A lot of the tools are about, you know, oftentimes when we go into panic, it's oftentimes an older traumatic memory that's surfacing. And one of the things that happens with trauma is that your ability to like put things into chronological order goes out the window. And so, you know, you may be experiencing emotions from an incident that you experienced 20 years ago, but your body doesn't know that it happened 20 years ago, right? Your body thinks it's happening now. And so, like, giving yourself some touch, like, touch is something that is happening right now. I don't like naming, like, oh, I see a computer screen and a webcam with a blue light and a bamboo ruler. Like naming things that are actually present in this moment can bring you into the present moment, right? So like a lot of those things are really supportive.
I mean, I do wonder if it's like past life, like past life trauma. Yeah.
My first therapist really helped me with that when she told me that like oftentimes like sometimes we have traumatic memories and traumatic responses, then it's clear, like, oh, I'm feeling this way because I experienced something similar in childhood. And then sometimes we have these feelings where it's like, I don't know where this is coming from. And my therapist said that, yeah, that's one of the challenges with intergenerational trauma is like we have the emotional feeling, but we don't always have the story that came with it. So it's confusing. And we can almost get into this like self-gaslighting of like, oh, I'm just being crazy, or like this isn't really I'm overthinking things. But yeah, oftentimes it is something older than that, you know. I also have this like recurring nightmare that I started having when I was like 4 years old, when like there's no way that my 4-year-old self could have that much anxiety because my life up until I was 6 was pretty, you know, comfortable. So yeah, a lot of intergenerational stuff for sure. A whole other thing we could talk about, of course. Any last thoughts or comments? A little bit of time. Or just like anything else that came up throughout this entire workshop is welcome too.
When I was looking at the support, the practices to support ourselves thing, it makes me realize that one of the things that I do is like try to override my own brain, like sometimes with loud music, or like it says humming to yourself, like I hum to myself constantly, or like, you know, that we talk in my group, we talked about like TV shows and stuff, is that sometimes you're just trying to like override the thinking part of your brain. And like moving your body or hugging yourself, like that's such a thing, because sometimes you don't want to hug another person because it feels like, you know, you can get into like, oh, am I like imposing on another person if you don't have that kind of relationship, but like hugging yourself or like that kind of tight feeling can like calm my body down. So anyway, it's just interesting to see all those things written down and be like, oh yeah, that's sort of instinctively I think what I do sometimes is just try to like override the part of my brain that's in overdrive.
Yeah, totally. And you know, a lot of somatic therapists will say that when someone is in panic and having a traumatic response, you know, oftentimes because we live in this such a heady world that we have a tendency to try to like talk someone down. but like talking someone down is something that happens like rationally in the part of our brain that's actually not accessible to us, right? So using bottom-up approaches that start with the body, that, like you said, like overrides the mind, can be really helpful. And I also share that, you know, I know part of the Care and Repair series and the work of the Necessary Trouble Collective is to actually build community around this. Like I came up doing a lot of nonviolent direct action organizing. And when we are engaged in things like direct action, it's very likely that someone's going to go into panic because these are like really high tense situations. And again, I would argue that just like being human in 2024, like you're likely to constantly be in panic. And so it's really important, like when we used to do preparations for direct action, we used to like say, okay, what's your phone number? Who has a cat that needs to be fed if you get arrested? Like who are all the lawyers, and is everyone kind of the legal? Like all of that is still important. But what's also important, like Carly said, is like when you are in panic, do you actually want someone to hug you and hold you? Or could that actually be re-traumatizing for you? Because we all have different relationships to touch and all of these things, right? And so like knowing all of these things about each other, when I'm in panic, this is what I look like. So please look for those signs because that means I'm in panic. And when you see that, please help me by doing these things and don't do these things, right? Those are really important things to know about each other if we're going to build communities that are able to care for each other. And so I just want to end with one collective practice. We all know that when we're in panic, taking a deep breath can be very grounding, right? At the same time, even though each of us have been breathing from the moment we came out of our parents' wombs, we're not all skilled at breathing because we don't practice breathing, right? I've had a meditation practice for well over a decade now, and I know that, you know, if you go to a Vipassana retreat, you're like aware of your breath for like 10 hours a day for 10 consecutive days. And after multiple times of doing that, I'm much better at utilizing one breath than I was 10 years ago. Like I'm practiced at breathing. My friend who's a nonviolent direct action trainer says that there's always time to take a breath. Even when a riot police officer is running towards you, there's still time to take a breath. And it's true, but at the same time, the more we practice breathing, the more we can get out of that breath. And one of the things that a lot of people don't realize is that the sympathetic nervous system, the part of the nervous system that activates you and puts you into panic, is regulated by the in-breath. And the parasympathetic nervous system, the part of the nervous system that helps you ground, that helps you slow down, is regulated by the out-breath. So oftentimes when we're in states of panic or when we're just like exercising and we're really tired, if you tell someone to take a deep breath, it can sound like this. It can sound like, right? Deep inhales and really short exhales. And that can actually put people into panic. So it's really important that we're practicing. You know, Catherine was helping us practice this earlier, right? Like taking an inhale and taking really slow exhales. So one strategy that helps us with that is called box breathing, which is when we breathe in for 4 counts, stop and hold your breath at the top for 4 counts, breathe out for 5 counts, stop and hold your breath at the bottom for 5 counts, breathe in for 4 counts, right? And just keep repeating that. So let's just practice that together a couple of times by, you know, finding a position that's comfortable for you, that is standing upright so that there's plenty of space in your torso to take in a deep breath. And wherever you are in this moment in your cycle of breath, just exhale all of that air out. And take a deep breath in, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4, out, 2, 3, 4, 5, hold, 2, 3, 4, 5, in, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4, out, 2, 3, 4, 5, hold, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that was just one really simple tool, but like any practice in nonviolence, it is a practice. And the more we practice in the safety of our dojos, if you will, our homes, our nonviolence workshops, our community spaces, the more it'll be integrated so that when we're in moments of panic, it becomes like muscle memory. It's the training that we've been doing, right? So really want to invite you to take a look at some of these emotional regulation tools, finding tools that work for you, and try to practice them before you actually need it. And that's the intention of practice, is to do these things so that it becomes muscle memory, so that when you actually need it, you've already been doing it. And again, for those of you that are able to join us in a couple of weeks, we'll do a little bit more stuff around creating more spaciousness in our bodies and making sure that we're caring for ourselves in the midst of a crazy world. So thank you all for taking a little bit of time today, and I'll hand the mic back to, is it to Catherine? No, to Carly, right? So yeah, thank you all. See you in a, oh, Catherine, thank you.
Thank you, Kazu. That was so delightful and supportive and hopeful, just, and some important reminders. Super grateful for you being here and sharing all of that with us. Thank you again. So I want to just share quickly my screen. And as we mentioned earlier, all of these workshops are offered on the principles of the gift economy. And I just want to lift up one of the 8 principles, which is intention. And, you know, what's so meaningful for me about offering things through the gift economy is to support people to really be in choice and intentional about what they give or don't give. And it's that intention and that practice of really being in choice that I think is so core and vital, and is very much, in my mind, a real nonviolence practice. And we, for transparency, share our annual budget for our organization and the fundraising target for our series here. This number is a little bit out of date, so we're probably closer to $2,000 raised so far. And super grateful for all the contributions. I also know that it can be a little tricky to contribute because our Sutra count is being a little bit fussy these days. So thank you all. And in closing, I just want to remind you of a couple of announcements, and Carly's going to put some links in the chat. Leonie, who is here, is going to be offering for BIPOC, starting on November 12th, a series teaching nonviolent communication through an anti-oppression, anti-racist, trauma-informed lens. It's super exciting. We also have 3 more sessions in our community care and repair series, and Kazu will be leading our next one, as he mentioned, with his session on from coping to thriving, and really recognizing and differentiating between the strategies we use when we're just coping and the strategies we use when we're thriving. And then finally, a link to the information about our in-person 6-day retreat on Bowen called Movements of Belonging, which Kazu will be one of our facilitators. Super excited about that, and really hoping all of you in the Vancouver, Lower Mainland, Southwestern BC area will consider joining us. The information on the website talks about activists and people in organizing in movement spaces, but we're really looking for anyone that's really committed to this vision of creating a world and doing it through movement spaces, helping each other to build practices of care, practice of connection, ensuring that our spaces are spaces where we feel that sense of belonging and feel that sense of care with each other. And as always, we are so, your feedback on these sessions is so vital to our growth. And they also are incredibly nourishing to read, super meaningful. We read everything and we try to incorporate as much as we can from your feedback because we really want these to be meaningful for you all. So if you would be willing to take a couple of moments as soon as you're off this call before you move on to your next thing, just to give us a little bit of feedback on how this was for you. And we totally welcome what people might consider negative feedback, any way that you want to express your experience and what could have made it more delightful and engaging, and what really worked for you is would be lovely. So on that, we are finished our time together. And if you want to take yourself off mute and just so we can all hear each other's voice and say a collective goodbye and thank you, gratitude to you all for being here, please do.
Hi, thank you.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Thanks
Bye.
everyone.
Kazu and Catherine.
Thanks everyone. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Kazu.